Cuba was an eye-opening experience in a beautiful country, and we were fortunate to go at such a unique time of both change and uncertainty between both our governments. Although only 3 weeks, we got a good glimpse at the current Cuba from a range of people from all generations and backgrounds. Most Cubans want to improve relations with us and lift the embargo. Economic growth is stagnating, and foreign direct investment is desperately needed as Venezuelan oil imports are cut. The Cuban Revolution had lofty ideals, but were propped up by Soviet trade. Good health and education remain, but there still is systemic racism and severe corruption. The recent reforms have allowed private businesses to take advantage of growing tourism, but this creates perverse incentives where taxi drivers can make more than doctors. Hopefully, Raul's currency unification can both increase exports and foreign direct investment.
Some things that we learned in Cuba that were surprising and enlightening. One main one that really struck out to me was that baseball was really no longer Cuba's main sport. It has been slowly developing into kind of secondary just because of all the defects of Cuban baseball players to America. And now soccer has been on the rise and it's slowly been taking over baseball in Cuba. And I found it also very interesting that how dangerous it was for these Cuban baseball players to get to America with the embargo and also just to find better baseball and have a better life for themselves. It was very interesting and a little bit scary and surprising. Another very surprising and I thought was depressing fact that I mentioned earlier was that for a Caribbean island, Cuba relies on 0.3% of its energy comes from solar, and I think it's a total of 1% comes from renewable sources, and sadly 90% of Cuba's energy comes from oil. It was very, very sad to hear, and it also even more sad to hear that they weren't really pushing for a development in non-renewables as a Caribbean island. It was also enlightening to hear lots of the lectures and professors talk about how even though the embargo has challenged Cuba has still found ways and other connections to get the supplies and everything they need to run their country. I think it was also very enlightening to hear that even with the embargo and the little communication that families have had from family members that have defected to America and how all the current political situations have slowly made it easier for them to now communicate, and when as before there was being excommunicated, they weren't really allowed to speak to these people, which is a very, very good thing for the Cuban people. I found it also not very surprising, but kind of an enlightening fact that racism, and not even just racism, but also bias against the LGBT community was still a factor that played in Cuba. And just to see how different it was compared to the United States, and how open we are here in the United States, and still how Cuba, how it's still a new thing to that country. When we first arrived there, our tour guide told us that that week was Pride Week. Yet I think the whole time we were there, we saw maybe one pride flag, and we didn't even get to see the so-called parade that happened in Havana. But while we were there, we did go, our whole group went to a gay bar, and it was extremely packed, extremely popular. So the fact that it's becoming a thing was a very enlightening and surprising thing. I think the last thing that surprised me was that coming to Cuba, I felt that most of the Cuban people wouldn't really like us, except for the fact that Americans bring money to Cuba. But our whole group was showed tremendous hospitality from our like homestay families, and even our lecturers were very, very nice. Even when we were talking or had to conduct our interviews on the streets, most of the vendors, the people that worked there, were very, very nice and very easy to talk to, which I honestly thought was extremely surprising because I mostly thought that Cubans would hold a grudge against Americans. So yeah. During our time spent in Cuba, it became very apparent that the ideals of the Cuban Revolution were still a central aspect of the Cuban daily life. This was obvious in the street art propaganda posted all over the cities of Old Havana and Trinidad and Pinar del Rio. Even on the highways going to those places, you would see lots of Revolution or Die banners, lots of banners promoting Fidel and Che Guevara, even some promoting Raul. Another main point is that all the souvenirs that they sold to tourists, lots of them also promoted the revolution and Che Guevara and Fidel and such. It became even more apparent when we visited the U.S. Embassy, and the woman talked about how Cuba has been a slowly developing country and how even post-revolution, there still hasn't been much change to the infrastructure of the city. The way that the internet just became a new thing to Cuba this past couple years, and how the media is still very tightly controlled by the government. And not even just the media aspect, but also the fact that the city itself, the infrastructure, has been slowly deteriorating, and there hasn't been much development within the city to fix its infrastructure. Also, the fact they have all their whole city, not even the whole city, the whole country itself, 90% of its energy comes from oil. They haven't developed away from or finding new aspects of basically what I'm trying to say is they just haven't been pushing forward. They're still stuck in the past. They haven't been trying to create new ways to better the city life of their people, or to really even, put forward advertisements for their new election coming up. There's absolutely nothing advertised about the election coming up next year, which we didn't even know was a thing until they told us at the U.S. Embassy that they have an election coming up in 2018. And even at the U.S. Embassy, she explained how she didn't really even know who possibly was even going to run. She just said that it was not going to be in the original families. It was going to be a new family and someone younger. And that hopefully that this new younger generation that will lead us would develop change in the future for Cuba.
I think one of the best ways we experienced Cuban history came through the Museum of the Revolution. I think that the presidential palace itself was very impressive and was a prime example of neoclassical architecture and had a lot of information going chronologically through the revolution from the Cuban perspective with a lot of propaganda. It was cool to see the spot where Batista escaped, as well as the grandma boat and the planes from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Going to the museum made me want to see The Godfather Part 3. Another way we experienced Cuban history came through the Literacy Museum, where we saw the books, lamps, and other historical pieces from the year-long Cuban literacy campaign. It was also very disturbing to hear about the killings of students and teachers committed by counter-revolutionaries likely supported by our own CIA.
Some of the best ways in which we experienced and learned about the current Cuban economic project is definitely through the lectures. Through the lectures, we really learned a lot about how the embargo has negatively impacted Cuba, and we really saw a need and a dependency for that embargo to be lifted, considering all the people that we spoke to and all the people that gave lectures all had a very strong opinion about how they wanted it to be lifted. through the lectures, it almost felt as if they were trying to convince us that the United States needs Cuba. Although, even if we adjust for inflation, what they contributed back in the 50s under Batista, they still would only contribute about roughly less than a quarter of 1% of our nation's GDP, which isn't much. And it's really not about the benefits we take, it's the benefits that Cuba would be able to get from this, because this would be a huge contribution to them because of all the trades they'll be able to make with us, all the foreign investment they'll be able to take. So they really want this to be lifted. Having normalized relations as well would also make sense, with Cuba being right there, just roughly under 100 miles from America. That trade cost would be lowered, definitely the transportation costs of goods and services. So that would definitely open up a lot for the Cuban people, and for it'd be easy to get a lot of foreign investment from America. I know there was a huge bid for it. Unfortunately, there is also a hate for our president because he has a very aggressive stance during Cuban policy. Um, and after coming back from Cuba, we've even realized that he is closing almost a lot of the policies, if not all the policies, that Obama implemented under his executive orders. Other things we saw were also just looking around Cuba, especially Havana. There are a lot of buildings that look very modern and up to date, and on the inside they're gorgeous and they have TVs. And there's other places that are just very run down and they're not painted well, and they don't look modern. They actually fit the setting more, whereas these other places are made to stand out more and really show that there is investment coming from foreign countries. But they look more touristy, these newer places, where the other places have been there for a while. One of the most interesting things that I think I saw was just the buildings. The buildings, when they were next to each other, there'd be like some buildings that were perfect, and the ones next to them would be just completely out of place. That almost looked scary to walk into. Even the confusion was even there. Like when I saw different floors, the second floor of some buildings would be painted, or the fourth floor would be painted, but the rest of the building wouldn't be painted, just because that investment is going only to that certain spot where all these new businesses are coming from. We believe that through our staying at the homestay, through going to lectures, by being able to talk to the Cuban people, going to museums, and really being able to experience all that Cuba has to offer, and not even just being in Havana the whole time, but being able to go to Trinidad and also going to Vinales, that we were really able to learn a lot about Cuba and the economic and social problems they have there. Being a communist country, it's definitely much more different than what we're used to in the States, and it was very cool to experience that firsthand. You definitely appreciate the smaller things that you take for granted here in the United States. And I think overall this was a very informative and cool experience that we all got to have through the CUBA ICA.